This video will explore the ecological dynamics of the pond found at Edith J. Carrier Arboretum.
When performing different studies, ecologists can choose which scale they are going to study. These scales range from anything from the population level, the community level, the ecosystem level, and finally the biosphere, which encompasses everything. However, when performing studies on something such as the Arboretum, which we are going to focus on today, it is most practical to focus on things such as the population scale and the community scale. Different experiments that can be performed at the population level are ones such as, does the coloration and size of koi fish affect mating trends? As for the community level, ecologists may choose to focus on something as, does the effect of the number of koi fish affect their different resources such as duckweed or other plants that they consume? Since there have not been many studies conducted in the Arboretum, I chose a table which took data from 17 different ponds in Essex, England, containing different types of fish. In the table, they have collected different data points and found different probabilities of finding different fish, and the p-values associated with them. A p-value is the estimated probability of rejecting a null hypothesis. A null hypothesis is a hypothesis with no correlation to what is being tested. For a dataset to be significant, the p-value must be less than 0.05 or 5%. However, in this case, it is 0.1 or 10% based on this study. Normally, though, if you obtain a p-value greater than 5%, it means there is no effect of ecological importance, or the data is not good enough and may need more data points in order to be supported properly. When sampling different data points, it is important that the estimate is accurate and unbiased, meaning that you are not trying to manipulate the data. It is also important that there is as little variation as possible, that way you don't obtain crazy results. And lastly, it is important that you use all of your resources effectively, including time, money, and effort.
Speciation can occur when populations become separated in space or become different enough in form and behavior that individuals from one group no longer regularly mates with individuals outside the group. One way for a new species to evolve starts when a few individuals populate a new area that is outside their native range. The conditions for reproductive isolation is then set, and the newly colonized population is on its way to becoming a new species. Over generations, the two separate populations will then be shaped by natural and sexual selection into different forms. This can occur in many ecological settings, including pond ecosystems. Speciation can be seen from the results of the guppy experiment in mountain streams in Trinidad. The guppy populations are separated from lower and higher pools by waterfalls. Above the waterfall, there were no predators present, and below the waterfall, there were guppies and predators. The lower stream guppies were all drably colored, whereas the higher stream guppies were all brightly colored. Male guppies were then naturally selected. Females were more attracted to brightly colored males, which resulted in successful reproduction. In the pools where predators were present, brightly colored males were more easily spotted by predators and eaten. So there was a counteracting selection pressure against bright-colored guppies. When drably colored guppies were moved and put into a pool where there were no guppies or predators present, the guppies eventually shifted towards a brighter coloration. Seasonal changes in ponds and lakes vary depending on geographic location, but they commonly respond in similar ways to the same ecological inputs. Temperature is one of the major factors affecting freshwater ecosystems. They affect the distribution of organisms seasonally, their behavior, and reproduction. Because most organisms in pond ecosystems are cold-blooded, they are considered ectotherms. Ectotherms cannot maintain their own body temperature and get their heat from external sources. Frogs, for an example, are ectotherms. They control their body temperature by changing their color, which affects how much heat they can absorb from the sun through their skin. As temperature changes at different times of day and night, they can move around in their environment to regulate their body heat, going into the shade or water to cool, and basking in the sun to warm up. They mostly bask in moist areas to prevent too much water loss. During very cold seasons, many frogs hibernate and hide on the ground in leaf litter and under rocks or tree roots. During very hot seasons, many frogs store water in their bladder. They even reduce water evaporation by minimizing their surface area by closing their eyes and tucking in their limbs. Some frogs huddle together or burrow into the ground to escape dry seasons. Increasing body temperature accelerates growth. Interactions are the effects organisms in a community have on one another. Ecological interactions are classified as two categories, interspecific and intraspecific competition. Interspecific interactions are the effects the individuals of different species have on one another. An example would be a dragonfly competing with a water boatman over a tadpole. Intraspecific competition is competition between members of the same species. They compete for the same resources, whether they're competing for light, space, food, shelter, mates, or water. Catfish, for an example, consume a wide variety of foods such as other smaller fish, invertebrates, aquatic plants, fish eggs, and algae. When they compete against other catfishes for food, they do not interact with one another directly. Instead, they deplete the resources that are available to each other. It is usually a very one-sided affair with one individual dominating over another. The stronger catfish will outcompete the weaker fish. This mechanism is also density dependent. The more crowded an individual is by its neighbors, the more overlap there is for resource availability. Thus, intraspecific food competition can exert powerful selective forces on all organisms. Migration may also occur if resources are low.
A niche is defined by the needs and tolerances of an organism, whereas a habitat is where the organism actually lives. The pond in the Arboretum hosts a variety of aquatic plants, goldfish, koi, turtles, frogs, and ducks, which affect the conditions and resources of the pond that influence the ecological niche and habitat of different organisms that inhabit the pond, as well as the organisms that live in the surrounding area. Conditions that can affect the pond include an average annual humidity that gets up to 76% in Harrisonburg, as well as the temperature of the air that can range from average highs of 40 to 85 degrees, January being the coldest month and July being the warmest, and average lows of 20 to 62 degrees, with, again, January being the coldest and July being the warmest. There's also an average precipitation of 36 inches and an annual snowfall of 24 inches. These different conditions create a potential multi-dimensional niche for the organisms that inhabit the pond. The terrestrial biome surrounding the pond is considered a temperate deciduous forest, which means that the biome is always changing with 4 distinct seasons. A temperate biome is also identified by its fertile soil due to the continual addition of organic matter by decomposers. Some species that inhabit the surrounding biome of the pond include clusters of flowering shrubs near the end of the pond, such as the Chinese dogwood and the Carolina silverbell that flowers April through June, and ferns that peak foliage in May. Located adjacent to the pond is a native azalea garden exhibiting flame azalea, plumleaf azalea, and a number of hybrid crosses among these natives. The forest also inhibits mixed species of oaks and hickories and the uncultivated swale where sycamore and elderberry grow naturally. They then receive intermittent flooding that provides a protective barrier to the rest of the arboretum from sudden erosion and also slows the flow of water into the pond. The aquatic system of the pond has a relatively stationary nature of water. This pond is shallow and located in the middle of a lawn, thus light can reach the bottom of the pond, allowing rooted plants and algae to thrive as seen on the outskirts of the pond. Because the water is relatively stationary, it can stratify vertically in response to temperature, meaning the upper layers that are exposed to the sun will be warmer, and since warm water is less dense than cold, it will rise to the top. This forms layers of cooler water and underneath, which also affects the oxygen content and nutrient input of the water because the waters exchange oxygen with the atmosphere. Because the arboretum is in a temperate region, stratification breaks down in the fall when the upper layer cools and the surface and bottom layers fully mix, putting oxygen into the bottom layer until winter stratification sets in. The surface layer will be colder, forming a layer of ice, and then in the spring, as the lake warms up again, it will mix from top to bottom until summer stratification sets back in.
The mallard duck is one of the species populations that reside in the Arboretum. The mallard is a genetic individual that has a predictable development, making it a unitary organism. This allows us to predict the life cycle of the mallard population. The mallard has 4 stages in its life cycle. The mallard begins as an egg that hatches after 28 days to become a nestling. Mallards remain in this life stage for approximately 50 to 60 days until they reach the juvenile life stage. After 1 year from hatching, the mallard reaches adulthood and can begin reproducing. Mallard ducks participate in pair bonding between October and March of each year to produce offspring, making an iteroparous species. Once the life cycle of the mallard is determined, we can evaluate the probability of survival to the next life stage. According to a research done by Matthew Kaminsky, the probability of survival increases as the mallard duck reaches each new life stage. The study also evaluated the fecundity of each life stage, showing that only adult mallards have the ability to produce offspring at about 14 eggs per mating season.
When it comes to mallards and wood ducks in the pond area, mallards will tend to nest on the ground, while wood ducks will primarily nest in the trees and above the ground, which can be seen with the wood duck boxes towards the back of the lake area. Mallards and wood ducks have niche differentiation due to different nesting areas, but still feed on similar resources and therefore have interspecific competition for terrestrial food sources. As mentioned before, I will be talking about interspecific competition between the mallards and the wood ducks. When looking at a competition equation for one of the two species, it will be mapped out using this equation, which represents dn over dt, represents the change in population over time, which is equal to the rate of births times the given population number, multiplied all over the carrying capacity minus the first number of the hypothetical species, subtracted by the coefficient, which is 1 onto 2, which means the effect that species 1 has on species 2 times the number of individuals in the second population all over the carrying capacity. The graphs will be represented, this is for one population, on the y-axis will be one population, on the x-axis will be a second, on the y-axis will be k over alpha 1, 2, and on the x-axis it will be k1. When below this isocline, the hypothetical population's numbers will increase to try to reach there, and when it's over, it will decrease to try to reach this equilibrium. That's the end of the first. In terms of interspecific competition between mallards and wood ducks for terrestrial food sources, we will focus on acorns, which can be seen throughout much of the trails. When taking both equations for the mallards and the wood ducks into effect, we can take the population equations and set them equal to 0, which will then make the n equal to k over the interspecific competition coefficient. When we graph both of these together, the isoclines will either go parallel to one another or they will intersect. And looking at the isoclines, when k over alpha is greater than k, we have coexistence between the two populations because the isoclines will the pressures on either side of both isoclines will push both populations to equilibrium in the middle, which will represent coexistence. When it is the opposite, and when k over alpha is less than k, then we will have an outcompetition of one of the two species occurring, where the pressure between the two isoclines will be pushed in opposite directions and will go away from each other, which represents either the mallards or the wood ducks completely outcompeting the other species, resulting in the extinction of that species. When dealing with predator behavior in the Arboretum's pond area, we will focus primarily on mallards as the predator and acorns as the prey. Although mallards will tend to favor insect, prey, and grains as food sources, as they tend to have a low handling time and high energy output, especially in terms of protein levels in insects, but during winter and early spring times, they will often eat acorns. Mallards' tendency to have a wider range of resources to eat, and therefore being broad-spectrum predators, foraging of the acorns will cause stress on the acorn tree populations in the arboretums,
We're going to discuss the predator-prey relationship between acorns and ducks, which in case acorns are going to be the prey. So for Locke of Altera, you begin with dA dt equals the intrinsic birth rate of acorns multiplied by their population minus the predation rate on acorns by ducks. So then you have your dd dt, which is your ducks, and you're going to have the rate at which ducks convert their predation on acorns into ducks as their births minus the death rate of ducks. So when you have this value, you will create a graph when you have your null lines, which will look something similar to this. You'll have your ducks on the y-axis and your acorns on the x-axis. For this value, you will get r over alpha, and for this value on your null line, you will get d over births times alpha. So what happens with the null line, there is no increase on that line for that predator or prey, so you form vectors. So below the horizontal line, the population is going to increase, and then above it, it's going to decrease. And so the same thing goes in a sense. So below this line you are decreasing in population, and then above it you increase. So you form vectors. When completed, will create a circle depending on where your starting population is for each. So you will get two graphs that isolate correspondingly with each other.
Since we just discussed a predator-prey relationship, we will now look at it from a larger scale by looking at a food web for a basics pond example. So here we have something that begins with a producer, such as algae or grass, and it goes all the way up to a tertiary or quaternary consumer. So it begins, you have your producer, and then that is consumed by a primary consumer, such as a snail, and then it progresses up to a secondary consumer, such as a duck. Our focus in this next example, we are going to look at a smaller food web with the duck as the prey, raccoon as a mesopredator, and a fox as a superpredator.
All right, here we have a superpredator, a mesopredator, and a prey. The superpredator preys on both meso and prey, and then the mesopredator only has predation on the prey. All right, we are going to form equations for each. So we'll start with the ducks. So we have dd dt is equal to the intrinsic rate of growth multiplied by their cells, and then it's competitive density dependent. So you have this in there, then you're going to have it subtracting the predation rate on it by each predator, which is the fox, and then the predation rate by the raccoon on the ducks. All right, so then we will have the raccoon's rate of growth. So you have its intrinsic growth rate multiplied by its competition. So you're going to have the fox affected, so 2 on 2 by 3 f over k2. And then we have and the final equation we form is on the fox. So we have the intrinsic rate of growth with competition of the raccoon. And then you add the rate at which it converts the prey into its own, so prey into a fox. That's the raccoon, and then you have the duck. and then you mine its death.
Dispersal of oak trees is a key factor in the predator-prey relationship between ducks and acorns. This plot demonstrates oak tree dispersal from immature to mature of a various species.